Night shift at the hospital moved like a slow breath, fluorescent lights humming, monitors ticking, nurses walking without urgency. A new nurse stood near the trauma bay, quiet, observant, almost invisible. No one asked questions. No one noticed how she never reacted to chaos the way others did. Then the alarms shifted. Security calls cut off mid-sentence. Doors at the emergency entrance were forced open from the outside. Footsteps, too many, too fast, entered the hospital like it was already theirs. Somewhere deep in the building, a locked cabinet was opened that should never have been touched by staff. And the quiet nurse finally looked up, like she had been expecting it all along. The night shift began without ceremony. In the city hospital, the emergency department never truly slept. It only changed its rhythm, day noise replaced by quieter urgency, footsteps softened by exhaustion, voices lowered but never absent. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the trauma corridor, casting a pale, steady glow over polished floors and stainless steel trolleys. The new nurse arrived 10 minutes before her assignment started. No one paid attention to her at first. New staff were common, and night shifts were not a place for introductions. She changed into scrubs without conversation, tied her hair back neatly, and checked her ID badge once, then not again. There was no nervousness in her movements, no hesitation, no unnecessary adjustment to her surroundings. Just efficiency. A senior nurse glanced at her briefly. "You're on general intake and trauma support. Shadow if you need to." She nodded. Understood. Nothing more. The shift moved forward. The emergency department filled slowly at first. Minor injuries, a drunk patient arguing with a guard, an elderly man with chest pain who tried to insist it was just gas. The usual pattern of a night hospital, unpredictable, but familiar in its chaos. The new nurse worked without drawing attention. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't interrupt. But she always appeared exactly where she was needed a few seconds before she was called. When a monitor alarmed, she was already adjusting the line. When a patient's oxygen level dipped, she was already repositioning them before the attending arrived. It was subtle. Easy to miss. Most people missed it. A junior nurse muttered once, half amused, half annoyed, "She's fast, or just lucky." No one responded. The trauma bay door swung open again. Paramedics rushed in with a car accident victim. The room snapped into controlled chaos, orders flying, gloves snapping, metal trays clinking. The new nurse stepped back immediately, giving space. Observing. Watching patterns rather than people. Her eyes moved differently than the others, not scanning for tasks, but mapping the room. Exits. Equipment placement. Staff positions. Timing between movements. She noticed things that had no immediate medical value. A monitor cable slightly frayed near a crash cart. A security badge reader that took half a second longer than expected to register. A hallway camera angled a few degrees off-center. Small details. Easy to ignore. She didn't ignore them. At 1:42 a.m., a loud argument broke out near admissions. A man refused treatment paperwork, shouting that he would not wait like this. Security escorted him out within minutes. The situation resolved quickly, forgotten almost immediately. Except the new nurse watched him leave longer than necessary. Not suspiciously. Analytically. Then she returned to her duties. At 2:10 a.m., a code blue was called in room 6. The team moved fast. The room filled instantly. She followed at a controlled pace, stopping at the threshold instead of entering immediately. She waited until positioning inside stabilized, then stepped in only when her presence would not disrupt flow. She assisted without commanding, without asking questions. She handed tools before they were requested, adjusted equipment angles without instruction, stabilized 4 lines with precise timing. A doctor noticed briefly. "You've done this before?" She didn't look up. "Yes." No elaboration followed. The doctor moved on. By 3 a.m., the hospital had settled into a fragile calm. The kind that never truly meant safety, only pause. The new nurse stood near the supply corridor, restocking quietly. Her hands moved with mechanical consistency, but her attention was elsewhere. She paused for a fraction of a second near a locked utility cabinet. Not touching it, just observing it. A maintenance worker passed behind her. That door sticks sometimes. Don't worry about it. She gave a small nod. Noted. No further reaction. At 3:17 a.m., she stepped into the break room briefly. The television in the corner played muted news. Something about regional unrest, border tensions, security alerts in nearby districts. No one was really watching. She glanced at it for 3 seconds, then turned away. At 3:29 a.m., she returned to the corridor outside trauma. Everything still appeared normal. But she stopped walking. Just for a moment. Her gaze shifted toward the far end of the emergency wing, the double doors leading outside. The ones meant for ambulances. The ones controlled by security protocol. She stared at them longer than necessary. A nurse passing by noticed. Something wrong. A pause. Then calmly, "No." She resumed walking. But her pace had changed. Slightly slower. Measured. Like someone listening to something others could not hear yet. Inside the hospital, nothing had happened. Not officially. But somewhere beyond the walls, something was already moving closer. And the quiet nurse, still unknown to almost everyone around her, had already started to adjust for it. Not reacting. Preparing. The hospital did not change its rhythm, but something inside its systems began to drift. At first, it was almost invisible. A delay in the security feed refresh near the east corridor. A brief gap in radio communication between the ambulance bay and internal dispatch. A locked door that required a second scan attempt before responding. Nothing serious on its own. Just enough to be noticed by someone who was already watching closely. The new nurse noticed. But she said nothing. At 3:41 a.m., a security officer paused near the central monitor station, frowning at the screen. "System lag again," he muttered. "IT said they fixed this last week." A technician shrugged without looking up. "Probably just overload. Night traffic spikes sometimes." The explanation was accepted quickly. Convenient answers always were. The nurse stood a few meters away, restocking a medication tray. Her movements remained steady, unbroken. But her attention had shifted fully to the security terminal reflection in the glass cabinet door. She wasn't watching the screen directly. She was watching its timing. There was a pattern forming in the delays. Irregular. Not random. Intentional, if someone understood systems at a different level. At 3:49 a.m., an internal call came through, low priority. A patient had wandered into a restricted hallway near radiology. Security responded slowly, almost casually. The situation was resolved within minutes. But something about the response time was wrong. The nurse noticed it immediately. Not the incident itself. The coordination behind it. At 4:03 a.m., the hospital's external gate camera flickered for less than 2 seconds. A maintenance technician nearby sighed. "These feeds are going to crash again if they keep this up." No one escalated it. No one logged it as urgent. But the nurse stopped walking for half a second when it happened. Just a pause. Then she continued. At 4:11 a.m., she passed a janitorial staff member in the corridor. "Long night," the man said casually. "Yes," she replied. Nothing else. But as she passed him, her eyes briefly shifted to his badge. Not checking identity. Checking clearance level. At 4:18 a.m., the first true inconsistency appeared. A security checkpoint log showed a door opening without a recorded badge scan. It lasted less than a second in the system. Automatically corrected. Automatically dismissed. The technician reviewed it, then shrugged. Glitch. The word ended the conversation. Except the nurse was now standing slightly closer to the monitor station than before. Not intruding. Just closer. At 4:27 a.m., a stretcher was rushed through the trauma corridor. A minor stabbing case from outside the hospital perimeter. Police presence accompanied it briefly, then left after handing over documentation. The emergency room absorbed it like everything else. But something changed in the air after the police left. The nurse noticed the shift in security behavior immediately. Not fear. Adjustment. Like protocols were being silently re-evaluated. At 4:39 a.m., she stepped into the supply room again. This time, she did not immediately begin work. She stood still for a moment in the center of the room, listening. The hospital was never truly silent, but now, the background noise felt segmented, mechanical, structured in a way it had not been earlier. She exhaled slowly, then resumed her task. At 4:52 a.m., a brief hospital-wide network interruption occurred. Lights did not flicker. Monitors did not fail. But communication lines between departments dropped for exactly 7 seconds. Then returned. No alarms triggered. No emergency protocol activated. Just another technical fluctuation. But the nurse's posture shifted slightly when it happened. Not visibly tense. Just recalibrated. At 4:55 a.m., she entered the corridor near the emergency exit doors. The same doors she had looked at earlier. Now she stood closer to them. Not touching them. Not attempting anything. Just observing the frame, the lock mechanism, the camera above it. A passing orderly spoke without stopping. "Those doors get stuck sometimes. Old building." She responded without looking at him. "Yes. I noticed." The orderly kept walking. At 5:02 a.m., the security officer from earlier returned to the monitor station. He looked more alert now. "Keep an eye on external feeds," he said. "Something feels off tonight." The technician nodded, still unconcerned. The nurse, now at the edge of the corridor, heard the words but did not react outwardly. Inside her silence, something had already aligned. At 5:09 a.m., a final anomaly appeared. A single external camera feed, just one, showed static for less than a second longer than the others. That camera faced the ambulance entry gate. The technician leaned forward slightly. "Probably interference," he said again. But his voice was less certain now. The nurse finally moved. Not toward the monitors. Not toward staff. But down the corridor, slowly, deliberately, toward the trauma wing intersection where visibility widened and exits converged. Her pace was unchanged. Her expression remained calm. But her attention was no longer on the hospital. It was beyond it. Something was approaching the perimeter. And now, the hospital was no longer just a place of treatment. It was becoming a point of entry. At 5:14 a.m., the first real rupture occurred. It did not begin with alarms. It did not begin with warning lights. It began with silence. The external ambulance gate camera froze for 3 seconds longer than normal. Then the feed returned, but the angle had shifted slightly, as if the camera had been nudged without physical contact. Inside the hospital, no one noticed immediately. Except the nurse. She stopped walking in the corridor near the trauma intersection. Not abruptly. Just paused. Like she had reached the exact point where waiting ended. At 5:16 a.m., the emergency entrance doors triggered an internal alert. Not a medical alert, an access fault. Security flagged it as a malfunction, not a breach. But the door did not open once. It opened twice. The second time was not recorded correctly. At 5:18 a.m., the first armed intruder entered the outer emergency vestibule disguised under controlled urgency, medical uniform, fast movement, coordinated timing. Behind him, more followed in staggered intervals designed to mimic emergency arrivals. But there were no ambulances outside. Only silence beyond the glass. Security responded slowly. Too slowly. The nurse turned her head slightly toward the sound of distant shouting. No surprise. No panic. Only recognition. At 5:21 a.m., the hospital radio system fractured into partial static. Words came through broken. Repeat, lockdown, unauthorized, corridors compromised. Then silence again. A security officer grabbed the nearest handset. Confirm situation. No clear answer returned. At 5:23 a.m., the emergency entrance was fully compromised. The doors were forced into controlled release, not broken, opened using internal override codes that should not have been accessible externally. That detail mattered. But no one understood it yet. The intruders moved inside in coordinated spacing, not chaos. Each positioned to control a corridor line of sight. Each movement designed for containment, not confrontation. This was not random violence. It was structured entry. At 5:25 a.m., the nurse stepped away from the trauma intersection and moved into a side corridor. Still not running. Still not reacting like the others. A junior staff member nearly collided with her. "We need to evacuate. Something's happening downstairs." The nurse looked at her briefly. "Move patients away from central corridors," she said calmly. No urgency in her voice. Only instruction. The junior hesitated. "Who are you two?" But she was already gone. At 5:27 a.m., the intruders reached the main emergency triage zone. The first confrontation happened in seconds. Not loud. Not dramatic. Controlled. A security guard raised his weapon but hesitated, visibly unsure whether he was allowed to escalate inside a hospital. That hesitation was enough. The intruders took control of the hallway. No shots fired yet. Only dominance established. At 5:29 a.m., hospital staff began locking down rooms manually. Panic started spreading, but unevenly, some corridors still unaware of what was happening just 2 wings away. The system was breaking into isolated pockets. And the nurse was moving through those pockets. Not away from danger. Toward structure. At 5:31 a.m., she entered a restricted utility corridor. This section was usually locked to all clinical staff. She accessed it without forcing anything. The door responded as if it recognized her. Inside, she paused for the first time in a fully enclosed space. A wall-mounted emergency control panel blinked softly. She did not touch it immediately. She observed. Then moved closer. At 5:33 a.m., the intruders began establishing corridor control lines. Patients were being redirected into holding rooms. Staff were being separated. Communication was collapsing into fragments. A doctor shouted for security backup. No response came. At 5:35 a.m., the nurse finally acted inside the utility corridor. She opened a secured cabinet, not with haste, but with certainty. Inside were emergency response tools not standard for hospital staff. She selected nothing yet. Just looked. At 5:36 a.m., in the distance, a loud crash echoed through the eastern wing, doors forced into secondary lockdown override failure. The hospital was no longer resisting as a single system. It was fragmenting. At 5:37 a.m., she closed the cabinet. Then turned back toward the corridor. Her movement changed slightly now. Not faster. Not panicked. But aligned. Like a decision had already been made long before the moment arrived. At 5:38 a.m., she stepped back into the hospital's main corridor network. And for the first time since the shift began, she was moving in the same direction as the intrusion. Not away from it. Into it. At 5:41 a.m., the hospital no longer felt like a controlled environment. It felt occupied. Corridors that once carried routine movement were now segmented by improvised checkpoints. Doors were either locked shut or forced open and held in place. The system was still running, but only in fragments, like a body functioning without full circulation. The intruders had not rushed. They had positioned. That difference mattered more than anyone inside realized. The nurse moved through the service corridor adjacent to the trauma wing. Lighting here was dimmer, older, less maintained. It created natural cover, but also longer shadows. She did not hurry. She listened more than she looked. At 5:43 a.m., she stopped near a junction where 3 corridors met. Voices carried faintly from the main hall, orders, movement, restrained panic. Someone was being told to stay down. Someone else was crying, quickly silenced. She shifted her position slightly to remain outside direct line of sight. Not hiding in fear. Avoiding unnecessary exposure. At 5:45 a.m., an armed intruder passed the intersection ahead. He moved with discipline, not aggression. His posture was upright, scanning systematically rather than randomly. This was not a civilian mindset. Not criminal chaos. Structured training was evident in every step. He paused briefly, listening. The nurse remained still. No tension in her face. Only calculation. The intruder continued forward. At 5:47 a.m., a junior doctor stumbled into the corridor from a side door, breath uneven. He froze when he saw the intruder presence further down the hall. The nurse stepped forward just enough to intercept his movement without being seen from the main corridor. "Go back," she said quietly. The doctor shook his head. "They're in the ward. People are." "Go back," she repeated. This time, he listened. He retreated. No explanation given. No time for it. At 5:49 a.m., the nurse moved again, this time toward a secondary access hallway leading behind the imaging department. This route bypassed main control lines. It was narrow, service-oriented, rarely used during peak emergencies. But she used it as if she knew it by memory. At 5:52 a.m., she encountered the first direct proximity to an armed intruder. He was positioned at the end of the corridor, partially turned away, communicating through a low device. His attention was split. A momentary gap. Not in security. In awareness. The nurse stopped immediately. Not retreating. Not advancing. Just holding position outside his perception window. The corridor was narrow enough that any movement would echo. She did not move. The intruder finished his transmission and turned slightly. Not fully facing her direction. Just enough that if she moved, she would be seen. A silent standoff formed. At 5:53 a.m., a distant crash echoed from the trauma wing again, another door breach or forced entry. The intruder reacted instinctively, turning his attention away for less than 2 seconds. That was enough. The nurse shifted backward silently into the side shadow of a maintenance alcove. No sound. No disruption. The intruder continued forward. He never saw her. At 5:56 a.m., she reached a small junction room used for equipment routing. The door was partially open. Inside, monitors displayed fragmented hospital system data, security feeds, partial room status, movement logs. The system was degrading, but not fully collapsed. She scanned quickly. Not the screens themselves. The patterns. At 5:58 a.m., she noticed something important. The intruders were not randomly distributed. They were forming containment geometry. Corridor control lines. Patient funneling. Isolation pockets. This was not a raid. It was structured occupation of space. At 6 a.m., she left the room. At 6:02 a.m., a gunshot echoed in the distance. Single. Controlled. Not panic fire. A signal shot or enforcement action. The hospital collectively reacted, but unevenly. Some areas froze, others continued moving under instruction they could no longer verify. At 6:04 a.m., the nurse entered a wider corridor near the imaging wing. This area had higher visibility and active intruder presence. She stopped before fully entering. Observed for 4 seconds. Then stepped in. At 6:05 a.m., she passed within sight of another armed intruder. He looked at her briefly. No recognition of threat. No urgency. She wore standard hospital scrubs. No insignia. No visible authority. Just another nurse in a collapsing system. He moved past her. At 6:06 a.m., she exhaled slowly. A small detail. Controlled. Not relief. Confirmation. At 6:08 a.m., she entered a partially secured doorway leading toward the central trauma axis. From here, movement became more dangerous. Lines of sight increased. Control points converged. She paused again. Longer this time. Not hesitation. Assessment. Then she continued forward. At 6:09 a.m., in the distance, a voice echoed through a loudspeaker, interrupted, unstable. Maintain control of East Wing, repeat, secure all. It cut off mid-sentence. The hospital was no longer receiving instructions. Only fragments of control. And the nurse, still unnoticed by most of the people inside, had now entered the same operational space as the intruders. Not as a victim. Not as a responder. But as something they had not accounted for. At 6:11 a.m., the hospital stopped behaving like a single facility. It became zones. Some under intruder control. Some under staff resistance. Some already abandoned. The central trauma axis remained the most unstable point, where movement, control, and confusion overlapped without coordination. and the nurse was moving toward it. At 6:13 a.m., she entered a narrow service passage behind the imaging wing. The lighting here was intermittent, flickering at irregular intervals. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and overheated wiring. She stopped once. Listened. Footsteps above. 2 sets. Coordinated spacing. Not rushing. She adjusted her direction slightly, avoiding the junction directly beneath them. No hesitation. Only correction. At 6:15 a.m., she reached a secured supply access point. This one required clearance beyond standard staff level. A small panel blinked red. She placed her hand near it, but did not rush. A second later, the panel changed state. Green. The door unlocked. She entered. Inside was controlled medical infrastructure storage, emergency kits, restricted trauma equipment, communication fallback tools meant for disaster protocols. But she didn't touch anything immediately. She scanned the room first. Not for supplies. For systems. At 6:17 a.m., she accessed a secondary wall console. The screen flickered before stabilizing. Partially degraded hospital layout appeared, live updates inconsistent, but usable. She studied movement clusters. Intruders were tightening control around 3 convergence points. Trauma intake. Central corridor junction. Pharmacy access route. She exhaled once. Low, controlled. At 6:19 a.m., she selected a compact emergency kit. Minimal equipment. No unnecessary tools. Everything chosen with purpose, not excess. She did not look like someone preparing for escalation. She looked like someone restoring order. At 6:21 a.m., she exited the room. The corridor outside was quieter than before. Too quiet. At 6:22 a.m., she paused near a corner intersection. Voices ahead. Not shouting. Command-level communication. Hold the line, no movement beyond Section C. Secure patient flow, repeat, contain only. Structured control. Not chaos. This was now organized occupation. At 6:24 a.m., she moved closer to the intersection but stayed outside direct visibility. Through partial reflection on a stainless steel surface, she observed 2 armed intruders coordinating movement between corridors. They were not reacting to hospital staff anymore. They were managing space. At 6:26 a.m., a hospital staff member stumbled into view from the opposite corridor, disoriented, panicked. One of the intruders raised a hand. A warning gesture. Not immediate aggression. Control first. Compliance expected. The staff member froze. At that moment, the nurse stepped slightly forward, not into confrontation, but into alignment with the corridor geometry. Her presence changed nothing externally. But internally, her positioning reduced the staff member's visibility to the intruders by half a step. The staff member was redirected by instinct, moving away without incident. No one noticed her influence. At 6:28 a.m., she continued forward. At 6:30 a.m., she reached a junction overlooking the central trauma axis. This was the first full visual of the occupied hospital interior. Controlled corridors. Segmented movement. Patients grouped and redirected. Staff isolated into pockets. The intruders were not searching anymore. They were stabilizing control. At 6:32 a.m., she observed silently. No reaction on her face. But her eyes tracked everything. Rotation timing between guards. Blind spots between camera angles. Response delay after movement detection. She was building a complete internal model. At 6:34 a.m., a brief disturbance occurred in the lower corridor, likely an attempted staff escape or miscommunication. Intruders responded quickly, adjusting positions with practiced efficiency. The system held. Barely. At 6:36 a.m., the nurse made a small adjustment in her route. Not toward safety. Toward structure convergence. At 6:38 a.m., she entered a side corridor that led parallel to the central trauma axis. From here, she could move without entering direct line-of-sight zones. She paused once more. Not because she was unsure. Because timing mattered. At 6:40 a.m., she proceeded. At 6:42 a.m., a distant announcement crackled through broken speakers. Medical staff remain in designated zones. It repeated twice before cutting out. The intruders were now issuing system-wide control language. At 6:44 a.m., she reached a transitional doorway between service corridor and main operational space. She stopped at the threshold, looked through, observed for 5 full seconds, then stepped forward. At 6:45 a.m., she entered the edge of the central trauma axis. And for the first time since the breach began, she was no longer navigating around the operation. She was inside its structure, unrecognized, unchallenged, but no longer distant. At 6:47 a.m., the hospital structure began to fail in ways that were no longer reversible through standard response. The intruders had shifted from movement to control enforcement. Corridors were no longer just occupied, they were segmented into enforceable zones. Entry and exit points were being selectively allowed or denied. Staff movement was being redirected with increasing precision. It was not chaos. It was pressure, applied evenly until the system broke itself. The nurse stood at the edge of the central trauma axis, observing without stepping fully into open exposure. From here, she could see the logic of the operation more clearly. This was containment architecture, not destruction. At 6:49 a.m., a secondary alarm system attempted to trigger hospital-wide lockdown override. It failed midway through activation. The screen froze, then reset. No one acknowledged it, but she did. At 6:51 a.m., movement patterns shifted again. The intruders were tightening toward 3 control nodes. Emergency medication access, central trauma intake flow, staff communication hub. Each node reinforced the others. If one collapsed, the others would stabilize the breach. This was coordinated pressure balancing. At 6:53 a.m., a hospital staff group attempted to move patients through a side corridor. They were intercepted almost immediately, not aggressively, but decisively. The intruders did not rush. They redirected. The patients were not harmed, but they were contained. That detail mattered. At 6:55 a.m., the nurse moved deeper into the Axis corridor network. Still unchallenged, still unseen as a threat. She walked past a partially open trauma room where a patient was being stabilized under armed supervision nearby. No one inside reacted to her presence. She was just hospital staff. That assumption protected her. At 6:57 a.m., she noticed a shift in intruder coordination. They were now communicating less verbally and more through positioning. Hand signals, corridor placement, silent timing adjustments. This meant the operation phase had transitioned from entry to stabilization. At 6:59 a.m., a loud metallic impact echoed through the upper wing. A secondary door breach or forced internal access attempt. The sound triggered immediate repositioning in multiple corridors. The system responded automatically to instability. At 7:01 a.m., the nurse paused near a junction where 3 corridors intersected under partial camera coverage. She remained just outside direct visual lines. 2 intruders passed through the far end of the corridor. They did not stop. They did not scan aggressively. They trusted their perimeter logic. At 7:03 a.m., hospital lighting flickered briefly. Power fluctuation. Backup systems engaged immediately. No full blackout occurred, but the instability was spreading. At 7:05 a.m., a staff member attempted to break through a restricted corridor leading toward exit access. He was stopped within seconds. Not violently. Controlled restraint. He was redirected back into a holding zone. The system was prioritizing containment over escalation. At 7:07 a.m., the nurse moved again. Her path now aligned with internal utility access behind the trauma axis. This route bypassed most direct surveillance lines. She was not avoiding detection anymore. She was avoiding interference. At 7:09 a.m., she entered a narrow maintenance corridor. Here, the noise of the hospital dulled. Muffled footsteps above. Distant commands filtered through walls. At 7:11 a.m., she stopped. Listened. The pattern had changed. Intruder communication frequency had increased. This meant uncertainty was rising. Systems were being adjusted. Not fully stable anymore. At 7:13 a.m., she reached a junction overlooking a secondary control corridor. From here, she could observe intruder coordination more clearly. They were reacting slightly faster than before. Less certainty in their movements. Small inefficiencies emerging. Pressure was beginning to affect their structure too. At 7:15 a.m., a sudden escalation occurred in the lower trauma wing. Multiple staff movements triggered overlapping responses. For the first time, intruder coordination showed delay. Half a second. Then 1 second. Then correction. The system was starting to strain. At 7:17 a.m., the nurse shifted her position slightly forward. Not into confrontation. Into proximity. At 7:19 a.m., she observed something critical. The control system depended heavily on uninterrupted corridor assumptions. Any disruption in timing would cascade across multiple zones. At 7:21 a.m., she exhaled slowly. Then adjusted her path. At 7:23 a.m., she moved toward a point where 3 corridor lines converged. Not random. Calculated. At 7:25 a.m., she stopped at a blind junction just outside a main operational corridor. From here, she could see the structure of the entire intrusion more clearly than before. And for the first time, she was not just inside the hospital's crisis. She was inside the pressure system holding it together. And it was beginning to crack. At 7:27 a.m., the hospital's instability reached a different kind of danger. Not collapse, but misalignment. Small failures in coordination were now visible across multiple corridors at once. The intruders were still in control, but control was no longer smooth. It was being corrected constantly, like a system compensating for unseen resistance. The nurse remained at the blind junction outside the main operational corridor. Still unseen. Still unmarked as a threat. But no longer irrelevant. At 7:29 a.m., movement in the adjacent wing changed suddenly. A patient transport route, previously secured, was being rerouted under pressure due to a blocked corridor. Staff attempted to redirect through a secondary passage. That passage led directly into a partially controlled zone. The nurse noticed immediately. Not through announcements. Through timing. At 7:31 a.m., she stepped forward into the edge of visibility. Not fully exposing herself. Just enough to see the transition point. 2 intruders were positioned at the far end of the corridor junction. Their spacing suggested anticipation of movement through that route. A trap without being labeled as one. At 7:33 a.m., the hospital staff group entered the corridor unaware of the change in control status. They were pushing a stretcher. 1 critical patient. 2 nurses. No armed escort. They had not received updated routing information. The system failure had already decided their path. At 7:35 a.m., the nurse moved. Not running. Not signaling. Just moving with purpose toward a service access panel along the corridor wall. At 7:36 a.m., she opened it. Inside, manual override routing access for emergency corridor controls. Old system. Rarely used. Still functional. At 7:37 a.m., she hesitated for the first time since the breach began. Not uncertainty. Assessment of consequence. If she triggered rerouting, it would disrupt intruder positioning, but also expose her system manipulation to detection. At 7:38 a.m., the stretcher group entered the corridor fully. They were now inside the danger line. The intruders adjusted slightly. They had noticed movement. At 7:39 a.m., the nurse made her decision. She activated a partial corridor diversion protocol. Not full lockdown. Not full override. A localized redirection. Just enough to shift flow away from the ambush point. At 7:40 a.m., the corridor lighting changed subtly. Door indicators shifted. Internal routing signals updated. The stretcher team hesitated for half a second as the path they were following became unclear. That half-second mattered. At 7:41 a.m., they turned away from the trap corridor. Redirected. Unknowingly saved. But the system change did not go unnoticed. 1 intruder paused. Head tilted slightly. Something was off. At 7:42 a.m., he moved toward the junction where the nurse stood. Not fast. Carefully. At 7:43 a.m., she stepped back into the maintenance corridor just as his line of sight approached. He passed the junction. Did not see her. But he stopped for a moment longer than necessary. Observing the environment. Sensing disruption. At 7:44 a.m., he spoke briefly into his communication device. Possible internal interference. The phrase was calm, but it changed the tone of the operation. At 7:45 a.m., the nurse remained still in the service corridor. Her breathing unchanged. But the environment had shifted. She was now part of the system they were actively trying to understand. At 7:47 a.m., distant voices rose in the central axis. Intruder coordination was tightening again. They were responding to uncertainty. And uncertainty meant risk. At 7:49 a.m., hospital staff movement decreased. People were being held in place more strictly now. Containment pressure increased. At 7:51 a.m., the nurse looked down the corridor. The decision she made had saved one group, but it had also increased scrutiny on the system itself. That was the cost. Silence had been broken, and now everything would begin to adapt. At 7:53 a.m., she stepped forward again. Not retreating. Not celebrating. Just continuing. Deeper into the structure that was now aware something inside it was not behaving according to its design. At 7:55 a.m., the hospital's internal conflict stopped being about corridors. It became about control of the center. The central trauma axis, once a functional emergency hub, was now the operational core of the entire intrusion. Every movement, every restriction, every delayed response across the building ultimately fed into it. And now it was tightening. At 7:57 a.m., the nurse reached the upper service walkway overlooking the trauma axis. From here, the full structure was visible. Intruders positioned at predictable intervals. Staff isolated into secured pockets. Patients grouped under controlled supervision. Exit routes narrowed into monitored funnels. It was precise. Almost engineered. At 7:59 a.m., communication interference increased again. Short bursts of instruction broke through. Maintain perimeter. No deviation from corridor control. Secure trauma intake. But something had changed in tone. Less certainty. More correction. At 8:01 a.m., a sudden shift occurred in the lower axis. A controlled breach attempt, this time from inside hospital staff coordination, forced intruders to reposition for the first time in a non-standard pattern. That mattered. It created imbalance. At 8:03 a.m., the nurse observed the response carefully. Intruders were no longer holding perfect geometry. They were adapting, which meant pressure was now affecting both sides. At 8:05 a.m., she moved from the upper walkway into a lateral service descent corridor leading closer to the trauma core. This was no longer observation distance. This was proximity. At 8:07 a.m., she paused before a final junction. Beyond it, the central trauma control zone. Multiple intruders. Active coordination. Restricted access. She did not rush. She assessed. At 8:09 a.m., she adjusted her position, aligning herself with the corridor's blind transition angle. Then stepped forward. At 8:10 a.m., she entered the outer edge of the central trauma zone. Immediately, the atmosphere changed. Heavier presence. Stricter movement control. Direct line-of-sight coverage from multiple points. She was now inside their operational core. At 8:11 a.m., two intruders noticed movement. Not alarmed. Just observant. A nurse in scrubs did not usually belong in this space. One began to move toward her position. Slowly. At 8:12 a.m., she stopped. Not because she was cornered. Because timing had aligned. At 8:13 a.m., a sudden internal disruption occurred in the opposite wing. Coordinated staff movement broke one of the containment lines. The intruders reacted instantly. Their attention split. That split was small, but enough. At 8:14 a.m., the nurse moved. Not toward escape. Toward control structure. At 8:15 a.m., She reached a secured internal access point used for emergency containment override systems. She opened it without visible hesitation. Inside, restricted emergency operational equipment. Not standard hospital tools. Controlled response resources. She selected only what was necessary. No excess. At 8:16 a.m., footsteps approached behind her. An intruder had closed distance. Close enough now to see her directly. For the first time, she was fully visible to them. He stopped. Evaluating. A nurse. In a restricted control zone. No weapon visible yet. But the system around her had already changed. At 8:17 a.m., she turned slightly. Not fully facing him. Just enough for awareness. At 8:18 a.m., distant corridor coordination broke again. Another internal disruption, forcing multiple intruders to reposition away from the central axis edge. The timing created a gap. A structural gap. At 8:19 a.m., she moved into it. Quietly. Precisely. At 8:20 a.m., the intruder behind her hesitated. Then turned to follow. But by the time he adjusted position, she was no longer where she had been. At 8:21 a.m., she was inside the control boundary of the trauma core system. And the structure that had been holding the hospital under pressure was now directly exposed to disruption from within. At 8:22 a.m., the entire axis began to destabilize. Not through force. Through timing failure. At 8:24 a.m., the structure that had held the hospital under control began to dissolve. Not in an explosion. Not in a sudden collapse. But in a series of failures that could no longer be corrected in time. Corridor coordination broke first. Then communication. Then containment spacing. The intruders were still present, but their system no longer behaved as a single unit. At 8:26 a.m., emergency response signals finally broke through from outside the hospital perimeter. Distant sirens. Helicopter rotor noise. Radio channels reactivating in fragmented bursts. The external world was returning. But inside, the situation was already shifting beyond clean control. At 8:28 a.m., the central trauma axis was partially abandoned by intruder movement. Not retreat in panic. Repositioning under loss of structure. Their formation had lost coherence. At 8:30 a.m., hospital staff began emerging from secured rooms in cautious stages. Some waited. Some moved without permission. Some simply tried to understand what was still safe. Confusion replaced containment. At 8:32 a.m., security forces entered the outer hospital perimeter. Clear commands. Controlled entry. Systematic clearing of corridors. The intruder's advantage was gone. But the hospital was not yet stable. At 8:34 a.m., the nurse was seen briefly near a side corridor leading away from the central axis. A doctor noticed her. Paused. Recognized her presence without fully understanding why it mattered. "Hey, wait," he started. She did not stop. At 8:35 a.m., she turned into a maintenance corridor and disappeared from direct view. No urgency. No acknowledgement. At 8:37 a.m., security teams reached the trauma core. They found structured disruption patterns, organized positioning, controlled access points, and deliberate containment behavior that did not match typical criminal intrusion models. One officer spoke quietly into his radio. This wasn't random. At 8:39 a.m., staff were guided into regrouping zones. Patients were reassessed. Systems slowly restored. But there were questions everywhere. Who had controlled movement inside the hospital during the breach? Who had prevented total collapse? At 8:41 a.m., the nurse was no longer visible in main corridors. Only brief sightings were reported. A figure moving through service passages. A nurse uniform. No urgency. No engagement with the arriving authorities. At 8:43 a.m., a senior medical officer reviewed internal logs. They showed something unusual. Selective corridor rerouting. Targeted movement redirection. Manual overrides activated from restricted access points. But no authorized staff matched the timing pattern. At 8:45 a.m., outside the trauma wing, a wounded intruder was being escorted by security. He stopped briefly. looked toward the hospital interior, then said something under his breath. There was someone inside the system. At 8:47 a.m., that statement was not recorded officially, but it was heard. At 8:50 a.m., the hospital began returning to functional status. Lights stabilized. Systems reset. Patient flow restored. But the atmosphere was different now. Heavier. Slower. Like the building itself remembered what had happened inside it. At 8:53 a.m., the nurse was last seen near a side exit corridor. Walking alone. No crowd. No attention. No recognition. Just movement away from the center of control. At 8:55 a.m., security personnel attempted to locate all staff involved in breach response coordination. Her name appeared in staffing records, but her role description did not explain anything that had been observed. At 8:57 a.m., a senior officer paused while reviewing footage. He stopped on a frame showing her near the central axis earlier. He zoomed in, then paused for a long moment. No commentary, just understanding forming slowly. At 9 a.m., the hospital officially declared the situation contained. But inside the building, quiet questions remained. Who had redirected movement patterns without command? Who had neutralized escalation points without being seen? And why did no one remember seeing her clearly during the most critical moments? At 9:03 a.m., the hospital corridor near the emergency exit was empty. Only routine staff movement returned. The crisis was over. But the structure of what had happened inside it was still being understood. And the nurse, quiet, unnoticed, unclaimed by any report, was already gone from the center of attention. Not because she disappeared, but because she had never belonged there in the first place. At 9:12 a.m., the hospital was no longer in crisis. But it was not calm. It was rebuilding itself through routine, staff returning to stations, monitors recalibrating, emergency bays being cleaned of debris and uncertainty. The kind of order that looks normal from a distance, but still carries tension underneath. Every corridor felt slightly different now, like something had passed through it and left no physical trace, only awareness. At 9:15 a.m., security teams completed their internal sweep of the facility. Doors were checked. Systems verified. Logs extracted for review. Everything was being documented. But the most important part of the night could not be clearly placed in any report. At 9:18 a.m., a senior physician stood near the trauma entrance, watching staff resume normal intake procedures. He spoke quietly to a colleague beside him. It didn't make sense how quickly containment failed, and then recovered. No answer came, because no one had a clean explanation. At 9:21 a.m., internal footage review was still ongoing in the command room. Fragments of corridor movement were replayed. Staff redirected away from conflict zones. Patients moved out of interception lines. Intruder formations destabilizing at precise moments. And always, in between those moments, a nurse. Walking. Never running. Never announcing herself. At 9:24 a.m., one officer paused the footage again. Not at a dramatic moment. At a simple one. A corridor junction. A decision point. She was standing there, still, for less than 2 seconds. Then the system had shifted around her. He leaned back slowly in his chair. No insignia, he said quietly. No command authorization, but every movement reacted to her positioning. No one responded. At 9:27 a.m., outside the hospital, daylight had fully taken over the sky. Ambulances arrived again under normal conditions. Patients were discharged or transferred. Life continued. At 9:30 a.m., the nurse's name appeared on a final staffing sheet for the night. Shift complete. No incident notes attached to her entry. No special designation. Just another line in a system that could not categorize what it had experienced. At 9:33 a.m., in a quiet hallway near the back exit, a cleaning staff member noticed a folded piece of hospital paper left on a bench. No signature. No message. Just an unused identification badge holder. Clean. Empty. As if it had never been filled properly to begin with. At 9:36 a.m., a security supervisor asked one final question in passing. Where did the new nurse go? No one had a clear answer. She had not been seen leaving. But she was no longer inside. At 9:40 a.m., the hospital resumed full operational status. Lights steady. Systems stable. Routine returning. But something remained in the way people moved. Slightly more cautious. Slightly more observant. As if the building had taught them, without words, that control inside it was not always where authority was expected. At 9:45 a.m., the trauma wing doors opened normally for a new emergency case. Staff responded instantly, professionally, as trained. No hesitation. No fear. But for a brief moment, a doctor looked down the corridor before entering. Empty. Still. Quiet. And for reasons he could not explain, he paused half a second longer than necessary. Then stepped inside. At 9:50 a.m., the hospital continued its day. No announcements were made about the night. No recognition was given. No name was repeated. But in internal review files that would never be publicly discussed, one conclusion slowly formed across multiple levels of observation. The breach had not been stopped by force alone. It had been broken by timing, by positioning, by someone who never announced control, but always moved as if the system already belonged to her understanding. At 9:55 a.m., the last corridor camera feed from the night was archived. The screen went dark, and the hospital returned to silence that looked normal from the outside, but no longer felt the same inside. The nurse was never officially highlighted, never called back, never mentioned again in staff debriefing beyond a single line. Unknown internal contributor stabilized multiple critical zones. No name, no face, just impact. And somewhere beyond the hospital gates, she had already disappeared back into ordinary life, as if nothing had ever been out of place at all.